because of just plain kindness, even if we can't get to justice yet. That's different, my friend, than telling other people how to live. Now, having said that, as sort of laying the foundation for understanding this part of the complicated part of Jesus' sermon, I want to move then now to the two statements that Jesus says to us, which I think gather all of that up. He turns to his disciples in this sermon, and he looks at them and he says, "You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world." And again, I want to point out right away, and maybe I'm not a good enough speaker to make this plain to you. Every sermon I have ever heard, there are a few exceptions, takes this statement that Jesus makes and turns it into an imperative. You ought to be the salt of the earth. You ought to be the light of the world. And I want to point out to you that I don't think Matthew made a mistake, nor do I think that Jesus made a mistake. He looked at the disciples and said, "You are salt." Now, I don't think he meant it for that reason, but I don't know if you could see that when I was turning to each of the children, saying to them, "You are salt," one of the children went and hid behind the other one. I think that actually is our response to this difficult proclamation of Jesus. You know, there's a shortage of salt right now. Did you know that? I was in the hardware store in Califon yesterday, and I'd gone in for something else, and a woman came in and said, "I need salt." And the person behind the desk said, "It's you and everybody else." She said, "Well, when is the truck coming?" And the woman behind the counter said, "I have some really bad news for you. There is no calcium chloride in all of Hunterdon County." She said, "In fact, they told us when we asked when would the next shipment be, they told us September. There is no salt." And I thought, I just let it I just absorbed it, thought, well, there's laying some context for the sermon. There's no salt. What salt does is it brings benefit, as we talked about. Jesus turns to his disciples and he says to them, "You are the salt of the earth." And I don't think they believed him. And I don't think we do either. I think we would rather turn it into an imperative, as Jesus was saying, well, you should become the salt of the earth. You should somehow be something in life that adds benefits to people's lives. You should become that. That's not what Jesus was doing. This is why it gets so hard to do. We're often, I don't know who to blame. I don't know whether to blame the preachers or whether to blame the listeners. But we often come to church looking for the instruction about what we're to do. What we're to do better, what we're to do to be better. We're looking for those concrete things. In fact, in sermon instruction in seminary, they say you ought to look over your sermon and figure out if you've decided what exactly it is you want the people who are listening to you to do. Well, at the end of my sermon today, the answer was nothing. 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 Jesus was not giving them something to do. He was, in fact, turning them to the hardest work that we have as human beings. And that is discovering who we already are. Who we already are. What we already are in the world. What our longing for mercy, what our longing for justice, our hearts open toward God, our deep and abiding sense, even sometimes of hurt and frustration, even our woundedness in life, everything that we are, everything that you and I are in this moment, exactly who we are, is exactly who Jesus needs to be who you are. And I believe that given the way the gospel has been interpreted always, over and over and over again, about you come to church to learn how you aren't what you're supposed to be, and then you try to get the right word by the right preacher to teach you how to become who you ought to be, our ears are stuck, and we cannot hear it. We cannot understand, we cannot believe for a moment that if Jesus were to sit down next to us today and he would turn to us, he wouldn't have a list of things we shouldn't have done from yesterday and a list of things we probably ought to get to tomorrow. I had a very good and helpful friend in the formation of my ministry. He loved me dearly. He was 30 years my senior. He graduated from college. I think this is right. He graduated from seminary the year I was born. And in my life, I was very grateful to him. He loved me. He loved what he described as my gifts for preaching. And that's unusual because as ministers, we tend to be a little competitive. We don't often share when someone comes along that we think really is gifted, and he never withheld it. He was always affirming of me, of my speaking, and of my preaching, and he came to listen to me preach early in my ministry, and I was so much wanted the feedback from him. I so much wanted to hear how I could improve, what it was he thought I should do better. And as he greeted me at the back door, he said to me as he took my hand, "Lou, what I want more than anything else for you as a preacher is to trust who you are. When you get into the pulpit, I want you to be you. Not for me, but because I have experienced who you are. When you get up there and you have all this list of things that you think you ought to do to have a good sermon, you've missed the point." And I'm going to tell you, I didn't believe him. I didn't. I thought to myself, I remember the dialogue in my head, well, yes, but you don't really know me. It's what all of us always do to this message from Jesus. It's how we always turn it into a message that defines us as not enough. It's how we always insist on seeing ourselves the way we see ourselves and the way others have been free to share that they see us with our deficiencies, and we never, ever really quite get it. I don't know, doesn't it? It sounds like liberal, sort of modern psychobabble, doesn't it? Just be who you are. Be who you are. That's what the verbs mean. That's why we study the language. There's no wiggle room. Jesus looked at the disciples and said, "You are the salt of the earth. You are the ones. You are the ones that I am planning through your living of your life to offer the salient blessings of human beings who find themselves in the center of God's love. Just be you. Just be you." What I like about church in the year 2014, maybe this isn't true, maybe some of you here have fooled me, but what I like about being a pastor in a church in the year 2014 is you don't have to come here anymore. I think for the most part there are very few pretenders attending church today. Very few. In my father's generation, you came to church if you wanted to get a promotion at work. You know that? Because you wanted your boss to see you at church. You came to church because it was a different day with parents and children, and if you were a child and your parent went to church, you went to church. My mother used to march 7 of us down the center aisle of the church. We stood but turned right, went in, sat in the pew, and never moved. We had to go to church. Those days have changed, and I think it's for the better, so that there are no pretenders here. No pretenders. You and I, we are in this for our lives. We are struggling. We're struggling to understand what God wants from us. We're understanding to know that love of God that sets us free in life. You and I are engaged in this, and it is exactly to you and me, to people just like you and me, that Jesus turns today and he challenges us with the most intimidating words of all, and he says, just that, just the way you are, that's exactly what the world needs. You are exactly what the world needs in this very moment. I just hope you believe it. So that who you are can be turned loose in the world. And all of that talk that is in your head, all of that you cannot, you should not, you ought not, all of that will somehow play a lesser role. When you and I fill our lives with a judgment of what we are not and what we have not done and don't do, you and I are paralyzed. We are like salt that is still in the container. We are trapped in ourselves, and we cannot let who we are have the influence that we are designed to have just by breathing in and out. We are like a light which is hidden under a bushel. And Jesus says this, no one does that. Either the light's going to go out or it's going to start a big fire. No one does that. When we are, I'm going to say it again, when we fill our lives with the judgments of what we are not and what we have not done and don't do, we paralyze ourselves into believing that we do not count. Jesus is speaking to his followers and asking us to realize who we are and what effect we are already having in the world in which we live. I am convinced that for most of us, we need to cut through the self-judgment and give ourselves a chance to say something nice about ourselves and to see for once what we actually do to be salt in the world. You are making a difference in the world today, my friends. You ought not to be covering it up, pushing it down, beating yourselves up with words of judgment that make it seem like as if you were never created to be quite good enough. Thank you. Nobody takes a light and hides it under a bushel. Why are you hiding the light that God has made you to be? You know a different truth. You know a different reality. Do you hear my friend speaking to Lou, the young pastor? Lou, be yourself. Be yourself. It was the most challenging instruction I had ever heard in all of my encouragements to be a pastor. Not that. Not that. You are the salt of the earth. Jesus is speaking to his followers, asking them and us to realize who we are. As you open yourself to the call of the gospel of God's age-old call to mercy, compassion, and justice and fairness. And listen, I don't know everything about your lives, but I know you are doing this. I know that you are seekers. I know that you are people who are hungry for justice in the world. I know that you are people whose hearts are already warm with the longing of God's love to be shared in the world. And what Jesus is saying to you, just be you. Jesus has a life-affirming message to us. Yes, my friends, we can always be better. believers and sometimes doubters, right? Sometimes more doubters than believers. You make a difference when you be you. Embracing the work of the Spirit that is in you now. Some of you are hearing the gospel and realizing perhaps it is good news. It is. Now you are also hearing that you make a difference in the world by being you. I'll tell you a little story that illustrates this, I think. And I think this is a very hard story. I love stories, but sometimes you can get different things out of them. And I want to tell this story. I'll just trust you to hear what I'm saying. This service is being taped, and my mother has learned how to use Facebook, and she listens to every sermon now. So, Mom, I'm sorry. My mother lived her whole life, mostly, I think, like a lot of women do, never measuring up to the expectations that were set out there for her. In a way that's kind of sad, I think, it was joyful but sad. She and my dad's lives were associated with a lot of very legalistic, very law-oriented Christians who had a very high standard for human behavior. And my mother spent most of her life believing, and she could prove it to you if you tested her, that she was just not good enough. Not good enough. She labored under that, and it was reinforced in a culture. It's not so much my father's preaching. I think my dad preached in many ways to challenge that idea, but the culture of being a Christian woman in a world raising 5, 6 sons and a daughter, it was like layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of never feeling good enough. She could never do it right. And if you're a psychologist today, I'm sure you'll want to do a lot of analytical work on this, but I remember early on a church service I went to, we used to have this thing in the evening service where people would stand up and they could ask for prayers for themselves. And my mother stood up, and I was there in the church, and she stood up and she asked forgiveness from God for being the failure that she was. And I don't blame my mom. I don't. I blame the strange way in which we have taken the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and for vast communities of people, we have turned it into a measure that they will never live up to. This is what Jesus is talking about in the text. I can't explain it to you, but it's what he's trying to get at when he says to them, he's talking to them about the law and the rules of the law, and Jesus is not trying to do away with the law. He's trying to come underneath human beings and fill human beings with a life and a love and a warmth that might actually give us the freedom to believe that we are who we are because God has made us this way. And yes, there's imperfection in us, but that doesn't undo God. God is moving through us and making a difference, and here's why I'm telling you the story today. At 84 years old, after believing for my mother's whole life that she really had nothing to offer, my mom lives in a remote area of Pennsylvania at the bottom of a big ravine. It's really breathtakingly dangerous to drive a car down there. And down there at the bottom of the hill, my mom lives, and there she is in her house one day, and she's looking out the window of her house, and a bicyclist, a cyclist, has decided to attempt that hill. They call this breakneck road over here. That's not breakneck road. This is break your whole body road. And he comes down the hill on the skinny tires, racing down the hill, helmet on, all the equipment on, and in front of my mother's house, he wipes out in the gravel. Devastating accident. Now here is what makes me very happy. My mom is sick and tired of believing that she's not enough. She's had enough of it. She has turned the bend. And you know what? My mom lives into a different message. If you don't like me, that's too bad for you. And she is like those women who wear purple. She has risen above. And she is living large, and she is doing what she believes is the right thing to do. And if her 7 children don't like it, well, too bad. And you know what that has done? My mother, who never believed that she could have ever done anything in her whole life, left her house. And she walked down the hill. And she got down next to that young man on the ground. And when she tells the story, she believed that God had put her right in that place to render aid to that human being. She got him up. And she brushed him off, and she wouldn't take no for an answer. She brought him in the house, and she made him soup. And she took care of him. Now here's the part where it gets complicated. Here's the part where it gets really good. Like, I would love to tell you that story and then she stopped there and said, on your way. No, you know what she did? She turned to him and she said, have you accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? Streams of understanding in life, it all comes together. And I listened to the story and I was weeping when she was telling me, and then she told the part about asking him if he'd accepted Jesus as a Savior. I said, oh, Mom. Oh. Do we understand why Jesus said, sometimes it is so difficult to do this thing of being a follower of God. Because in some ways, you just can't make the list. You can't say, here are the things you have to do. Here are the questions you have to ask of people. Here's the 9 points. You fill them out and then you're there. It's just not like that. God is not like that. The earth is not like that. I'm sorry, it's a lot more amorphous. Yes, it is somewhat organized, but ask the scientists. Ask them. They'll tell you that underneath, way down underneath the structure of all the universe, it's messy down there. It's messy. It's unpredictable. It's not structured like it looks. Yes, the laws exist, but the laws, the scientists will tell you, the atoms and the electrons will tell you, the laws are meant for breaking. And that really disturbs them. Underneath, it's messy. Jesus is engaging, and God engages at the very center, at the underneath, at the center of who you are, not what you can do, but who you are. And the message of the gospel, the message of God to Abram and Sarah, the message when it is lived throughout the Hebrew faith, when anyone in any faith gets a hold of this, it is a message that begins with the profound message that whether or not you believe it, whether or not you understand it, you are exactly who you need to be for God to make a blessing, to do a difference in this world, and you desperately need it. I really believe, listen to this, I really believe the message of Jesus then and to now is this: I don't want you to be different than you are. I don't want you to be different than you are. I probably ought to preach this sermon next week. My dad one time, talked about my mother, so I'll plug my dad. My dad one time preached a sermon on love, and he was at a kind of an angry stage of his life, and he decided the congregation didn't really accept the sermon. He preached the same sermon for 7 Sundays in a row. Same sermon. Come back next week, I'm going to tell you the same thing. I'm going to tell you the same sermon. And why? Because I still don't get it yet. I still am unable sometimes to breathe the freedom of the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ to be set free in the world to make the difference that that God has every intention of making through me. I don't want you to be different than you are. I don't want you to improve what you do. I want you to realize who you already are and trust that that is making a difference in the world. I'll challenge you through this week to try to look at yourself and your life and what you do differently. To look at the places where you think there's nothing. Keep looking until you see what's there to see. Trust that you are already making a difference in the world. And would you dare, in defiance of everything you've been told, to see it, to acknowledge it. You'll feel like such a conceited person. See how God is doing it through you. Learn to love